Kia ora koutou, ko Andrew Wick tōku ingoa. Today I'll be presenting on solar farming in New Zealand. My presentation aims to walk you through this complex and rapidly evolving space, starting with some background about where we're at with the solar industry in New Zealand, and then focusing on the environmental law issue I researched. I'll end by discussing the relevant statutes and policies relevant to this issue, and we'll ponder whether it's an issue that needs addressing at all. Let's start with the current state of affairs with the solar industry internationally and in New Zealand. Generating renewable energy via solar power has been the fastest growing renewable energy source worldwide for the last decade and is increasingly competing with dominant renewable energy like hydropower and wind. What I want you to take away from this first graph is that the solar industry isn't new, and there are countries that we can look to learn from their experiences with the solar industry. In New Zealand, the solar industry currently contributes around 1% to the roughly 85% of electricity generated from renewable energy sources. However, as you can see from the second graph, the growth of New Zealand's solar industry has recently undergone a steep increase. This increase is linked to New Zealand having an unexploited solar market and it now being profitable to invest in solar on a large scale. Additionally, electricity demand and renewable energy generation are forecasted to snowball as New Zealand increasingly electrifies and moves away from fossil fuel derived energy in our efforts to have a net zero energy sector by 2050. So, this brings us to today, where the solar boom is only just beginning, with 67% of New Zealand's actively pursued energy generation projects dominated by solar, which will more than double the existing solar capacity shown in graph 2 in New Zealand. To better understand my topic, you need a quick crash course on how the energy sector operates. In New Zealand, you tend to see centralized power stations like hydrothermal or geothermal plants that produce electricity that flows directly into the transmission grid, which then transports electricity around the country. This is also where utility scale solar farms are most likely to connect. These farms are large in scale with a generation capacity typically greater than 5 megawatts and are built to generate electricity for the transmission grid. The problem that countries worldwide are currently dealing with is that solar electricity can also be produced as a distributed energy resource, which means it can produce electricity that feeds the local distribution network. This network of power lines transports electricity from the transmission grid to our homes. My focus for this presentation is on the largely untapped market of distribution connected utility scale solar farms. These often take the form of agri-PV farms, which combine solar power generation with sheep, cattle or horticulture farming with the aim to diversify income and increase farmland productivity without displacing production. These farms are more common internationally, typically producing less electricity than a centralized solar farm and primarily connect to the local distribution network. The problem with distributed sources of energy is that because distribution networks are designed for a one-way flow of electricity from a centralized source to our homes, the addition of distributed solar power impacts the network and means that the network can only host so much electricity, which is heading in the opposite direction. With this in mind, my topic was inspired by research in Germany and California, which found that their deployment of solar as a distributed energy resource was inequitable. For my research, I first wanted to find out whether an equity issue might exist with a first-come, first-served approach to establishing distribution-connected solar farms in New Zealand, and if so, should it be addressed, and how might it be addressed? Research by Vaughan et al. Showed us that it is economically feasible to establish agri-PV farms in New Zealand. And the latest New Zealand Energy Investment Survey showed us that distribution-connected solar farms will increase in the future. However, solar farms are also becoming more challenging to connect to the distribution network. Modeling by Miller in 2020 suggests that this trend will continue until the electricity network's hosting capacity is reached in 10 to 20 years. Furthermore, in the literature on this topic, equity issues are often linked to the deployment of solar technology in the distribution network. For example, inequity is associated with declining equal access opportunities to own and export solar electricity into a distribution network over time, thus minimizing potential economic, environmental, and social benefits from being able to do so. I therefore argue that New Zealand's market-driven, first-come, first-served approach to connecting distribution-connected solar farms perpetuates this equity issue. I further argue that this becomes an environmental law issue, as this inequity may incentivize a first mover to develop a more extensive solar farm, as they can utilize more network capacity and thus develop on more productive land than necessary. Secondly, this inequity may disincentivize late adopting farmers from including solar technology on their farms, which can minimize the positive ecological, social, and emissions reduction benefits associated with solar energy. So, with that said, I now want to focus on the relevant statutes and policies that facilitate the existing consenting and connection of solar farms to the distribution network. Regarding the consenting framework for solar farms under the Resource Management Act, local authorities must have particular regard to the matters of Section 7 shown on this slide, particularly the benefits to be derived from the use and development of renewable energy. Additionally, various national environmental standards and policy statements are relevant for gaining resource consent through the RMA. Today, most local authority planning documents don't classify solar farms, so land use consents, if granted, are generally given on a discretionary basis. Of the national policy statements, the NPS for renewable electricity generation is the most relevant for consenting solar farms. This policy was developed to recognise and provide for the national significance of renewable activities in local authority plans and policies to ultimately increase the proportion of New Zealand's electricity generated from renewable sources. The NPS for highly productive land is also relevant for consenting solar farms, particularly Policy 8, which protects highly productive farmland from inappropriate use and development. As it stands, the consenting environment for solar farms is set to change with a new, more strongly worded and directive national policy statement for renewable electricity generation being considered, alongside a proposal for a national environmental standard for renewable electricity generation activities, which could set a nationally consistent activity class for large-scale solar farms. An amended national policy statement for highly productive land is also being developed following consultation to explicitly allow for the construction of solar farms on productive land. Other statutes relevant to the development of solar farms are listed on this slide. Of note is the Electricity Industry Act, which established the Electricity Industry Participation Code. Part 6 of this code details requirements for distribution companies to consider when approving applications for a solar farm to connect to their network. So, this brings me to my final question. How might an equity issue caused by the first come, first served approval process of distribution connected solar farms be addressed, and is it worth addressing at all? I believe that any approach to address this issue is complex simply because greater government involvement would be required to support and fund an equitable solar farm transition and to ensure that equitable policies are embedded in the Electricity Industry Participation Code. This is also unlikely considering New Zealand's solar industry has historically been market-led. Also, an argument could be made that an equity approach is actually counterproductive to maximizing electricity production, as the current first-served approach may actually decrease the amount of productive land that needs to be covered with solar panels and likely increases the economic viability of solar farms. This is the case as more electricity can be produced from one large farm than multiple small ones, and more profit is accessible at a larger scale, which is benefited by the current first-come, first-served system. Furthermore, the NPS for renewable electricity generation is already viewed as not being enabling enough, so any amendments made here would only increase consent, approval, and development timeframes, which opposes the government's motivation behind amending the policy statement in the first place. Ultimately, New Zealand is in a fortunate position because most of its electricity generation is produced renewably, so the same rush for an equitable and highly renewable energy future is less pressing than for other countries. However, we also have an aging distribution network that needs reinvestment and a rapidly changing energy sector, so if solar farm equity is to be ensured, it's crucial to embed this in policy like the soon-to-be-released New Zealand Energy Strategy as soon as possible. Thank you. You can contact me here if you have any questions and scan my QR code for my bibliography. Thank you.